right, everybody, welcome back. In this exploration, we are going to begin looking at cellular respiration. This is Unit 3, Lesson 2, Exploration 1. We just finished looking at a chemical reaction called photosynthesis, where plants are able to take sunlight, or really any other visible light energy, and they are able to convert it into a form of chemical energy that can be stored and either used by that plant or used by other organisms. So today, we're going to talk about how that stored energy gets broken down so that the energy inside can actually be released and used by whatever organism needs it. Now, when we talk about chemical energy, again, we're just talking about energy that can be stored and saved. And there's lots of different types of chemical energy. We are going to be talking about glucose in this lesson. But another type of very common chemical energy is ethanol. This is part of the fuel that we put in our cars. Really, anything that contains a carbon-based compound that stores energy is a type of chemical energy. So the food that you eat, the gas that you put in your cars, all of these are different types of chemical energies, and they're all carbon-based. Now, what happens here is that all energy sources can be traced back to the sun, right? One way or another, there was a plant that absorbed sunlight and turned it into this chemical energy that we're talking about. Now, this could have been because an animal died and was buried, and over the long period of time, their bodies were smashed into the fossil fuels that we use today. Okay, all fossil fuels were formerly organic substances that got converted into the oil, the coal, and the natural gas that we use. Now, again, the type of chemical energy that we're going to look at, though, is the sugars in the form of glucose that can be broken down in a process called cellular respiration. And in the same way that your car is able to burn the gasoline that you put into it to release the energy, your cells are able to, burn, so to say, the glucose, which is found in the food that you eat, to release that same energy that's found inside. Now, cellular respiration is an exothermic reaction. Remember, exothermic means that energy is released and the products have a lower starting energy than the reactants. We have to input a little bit of energy to get this process started, but once we start the process, tons and tons and tons of energy is released, and therefore we get this exothermic graph right here. Now, this is a lab that we would have done if we were in class, but I want you to take a look at this video because this is kind of to show you what we would have done. There's an activity where you exhale into a beaker, or in this case a cup, filled with a solution. And when you do that, the solution is going to turn a different color, okay? And depending upon how much carbon dioxide you have in your breath will change how fast that occurs. So, like I said, the goal would be for you to do a test run and to time it. And then I would have you exercise in some fashion for about a minute, doing jumping jacks or jogging in place or something along those lines. And then we would have you do it again to see the difference in how fast that liquid changes color, because the more carbon dioxide in your system, the faster that color change is going to occur. Now you might say, well, why would there be more carbon dioxide? Well, as your body exercises, your cells require more energy. And as a result of that, that energy creates more carbon dioxide because we're breaking down more sugar. And we'll get into how that happens in our next exploration. But for now, let's just kind of look at, in general, what's taking place here. All right, so once again, cellular respiration is where we break down glucose and we release the energy that is stored inside of the chemical bonds in that glucose molecule. Remember, the chemical energy that our cells use is called ATP. All right, now this process is also going to release heat. The heat that's released is why our bodies can maintain an internal temperature, because our cells are constantly doing cellular respiration to get energy, and by extension, they're constantly releasing heat. And we talked earlier in Unit 1 about how that heat is regulated through homeostasis and through that negative feedback loop. Now, there's two terms that I want you to be familiar with. First of all, the word aerobic. Okay, aerobic means that it requires oxygen to take place. Cellular respiration is an aerobic process, meaning in order for it to fully finish, there has to be oxygen available in the blood to be able to pull this off. Now, as you can probably imagine, the anaerobic vocabulary word that goes with it means that it does not require oxygen. We're going to talk about what happens in your bodies if you run out of oxygen, if you're exercising, or if you're lifting, or if you're just running really far. What can happen is that your body runs out of oxygen, and rather than just falling over and not being able to do anything else, you start to feel yourself struggling, which is kind of like your body's way of saying, hey, we're running out of oxygen. We've got our emergency tank here, but it's not as good. And if you keep going, it's going to be tough for you to continue making the energy that you need. Again, that's a process called fermentation, and we'll talk more about that in our next exploration. I want to show you this diagram right here. This is a good kind of review for you to just see what these inputs and outputs are for this reaction. All right. In cellular respiration, living organisms that are going to perform this need to bring in oxygen, and they also need to bring in glucose. Okay. And as they perform this reaction, they're going to produce water as well as carbon dioxide. There's going to be heat that is released, and the number one thing we're looking for is that ATP. We want to release the ATP that is trapped inside this glucose molecule. Now, I want you to look at this. This is kind of small, but hopefully you can see it. The equation for photosynthesis is found right here. And I want you to make sure you clearly understand this equation because it should look familiar to you. All right? When I told you to look at the equation for photosynthesis in our previous lesson, I did that so that you would recognize all of the components, all the parts. In respiration, the reactants, otherwise known as the inputs, are the same as the products of photosynthesis. If you remember, in photosynthesis, we're taking carbon dioxide and water, and we're using light energy to convert them into glucose and oxygen. Well, respiration is just the opposite. We take glucose and oxygen, and we break those things down, and we produce carbon dioxide, water, heat, and ATP as a result. All right, so what I want you to see is that they're the same, just flipped. Okay, let's talk about where cellular respiration takes place. Respiration takes place inside of an organelle called the mitochondria. Now, we talked about mitochondria when we talked about the parts of a cell. Mitochondria produces energy. They do it by performing this reaction. Now, both plant and animal cells contain mitochondria. That's an important piece. Some people think that just because plants can do photosynthesis that they don't need respiration to take place, and that's not true. It's kind of like how solar panels are useful, but they're not totally reliable for an exclusive source of energy. Plants need to be able to make sugars and then break those sugars down to get the energy they need because they can't always count on the sun providing all of their energy for all of their cell processes. The sun really just provides enough energy for them to make the food that they can use later. Here are a couple of the parts of that mitochondria. The key part that I want you to see is the cristae and the matrix. We're going to talk about the stages of respiration, and knowing where these stages take place is key. So you might want to come back to this diagram later on and look at these different parts because we're going to discuss how these processes are carried out in these different locations. All right, now finally, the last thing that I want to talk to you about is, again, that direct comparison of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. All energy comes from photosynthesis. We get our energy from the sun, but it has to be converted into a form that we can use first. And so that's what we looked at last week. CO2 and water are used with the light energy that comes from the sun to make our glucose molecule, and then we release oxygen. But when we flip that, we do respiration, and we use that glucose in the presence of oxygen to produce ATP, and in the midst of doing that, we're releasing heat, water, and CO2. All right.